I want to acknowledge the OCLC Research Library Partnership, which both underwrites and inspires our work. Attendees from this webinar are from the OCLC RLP, and I want to thank you for your continued support and input into our work. These are both crucial to our success. So I am thrilled to welcome our presenters, David Lewis, Mike Roy, and Catherine Skinner. It has been a real pleasure to work with these team members and fantastic collaborators, and I just know that you are going to enjoy this presentation and learn a lot. I'm going to turn things over now to David Lewis, who will kick things off for us. So take it away, David.
So thank you all very much. We were encouraged to show you pictures of ourselves so you can know who you're listening to. So I am the one with the tie, which I haven't worn in a long, long time these days. So what we're going to do today, I'll briefly do an introduction, and then we'll run through the various parts of the project that we've been working on. There's a literature review, a census of infrastructure providers, some case studies on infrastructure providers, a survey of libraries, and some focus groups with library leaders. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. That certainly is our intent. So the introduction, here this is me again. This project grew out of the 2.5% commitment proposal that I put together in the summer of 2017. I put that paper out to some of my friends and colleagues, and among them was Mike Roy, who suggested that we actually do some work on it. We did some initial fairly informal data collection in the fall of 2017, and that was reasonably well received. And so we then went on and attempted to identify and get some funding, which we did from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which has supported the project, and we're grateful for that support. Mike and I are the principal investigators. The Educopia Institute and Catherine Skinner is a major consultant on the project, and so the three of us have really done most of the work on the project. In addition to that, there was consulting from True Bearing consulting firm, particularly Nathan Brown, and he did work on the survey and the census and did the data analysis. So that was, he was the consultant on that piece of the work. So what we wanted to do, 2.5% solution had to do with open. But when we went to Mellon, Mellon was not quite interested in exactly what we wanted to do. So they wanted us to look at infrastructure only and not content. So the 2.5% solution had to do with both content and infrastructure. And we only are looking at infrastructure in this project. And we're looking both at open and proprietary infrastructure, not simply open. And so it's a slightly different piece than the 2.5%. But that's what the funder said, so that's what we did. The project had two primary goals. The first was to map the range of infrastructure that supports the digital scholarly communications, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a couple of minutes. And then to survey college and university libraries and library leaders to understand the current investments that these libraries are making in infrastructure and their motivations for doing that. So again, we did 5 things, and we'll review them in this order. We'll start with the literature review, which I have come to call a bibliographic scan. And then Catherine will talk about the census of infrastructure and the case studies. Mike will talk about the survey of academic libraries, and I'll conclude with the summary of the focus group on academic library leaders. So the bibliographic scan, the results of this have been fairly recently published. It's on there's a piece of the Educopia site where this project and the formal things that we have completed are there. So this is a completed document. You can go look at it. I looked at in doing this, I looked at broadly at the literature, particularly the web-based literature, I identified 206 projects that roughly fell within the digital scholarly communications infrastructure. Of those, 139 were not-for-profit and 67 were commercial. There were 17 institutions that supported a number of projects. 6 of those were commercial and are the usual players that you would expect. But there are 11 not-for-profit organizations that support a significant piece of the infrastructure. And again, these are familiar to you. If you look at the scale of the operations, obviously the commercial providers, I think all of them would have more heft than the combined heft of all of the open projects. So this is as close as we've gotten to a map of the digital scholarly communications infrastructure. And I'll walk through the different pieces of it, but you can see by looking at this sort of the scope of what we're talking about. We start with a series of researcher tools. These are generic tools that in general facilitate authorship and analysis. We did not include any tools that were specific to different disciplines or specific applications like statistical products or mapping products. We then looked at repository, the chain of publication broadly speaking, beginning with informal pieces in repositories, then what we've called publishing, which is more formal publishing, preservation and assessment, and then looked at discovery and what I've called general services, which are a variety of things that support the whole of the system. So what I want to do now is sort of walk through each piece and make some general statements about each section. So we'll start at the top and work our way down. So general services are things like Creative Commons, Crossref, ORCID, IIIF. Most of these products are not-for-profit. They're in general community managed, although that is a bit vague in what that means. Clearly, they're not just managed by the library part of the community, but by the whole publishing, many of them by the whole publishing infrastructure, including often for-profit enterprises. So when we looked at researcher tools, when I looked at researcher tools, the important collaboration, reading, and reference management tools are primarily commercial and managed by the large players. There are a mix of writing tools that some of which are not-for-profit and open. But by and large, this structure, this piece, this end of the process is dominated by commercial firms. So if we look at discovery, again, there are I did not look at specific discipline-based discovery tools, but again, if you look at the players in this space, they are large commercial enterprises, although in many of them, particularly Google Scholar, are sort of bigger than the domain that we're used to thinking about. So it's not simply the big commercial providers that we like to complain about, but people who are even much larger than those. There are a variety of interesting not-for-profit projects. I think Unpaywall is a really good example of how a very small organization has positioned itself in a very important way in the infrastructure. And I think there are, it's an interesting example, but it's not unique. There are a variety of fairly small, nimble organizations that have done some very interesting and important things. Open Access Button is another one that I think falls in that category. There are in the discovery space, and this is not different from the way discovery has been for probably the last 20 years, technology continues to find ways to make discovery more powerful. There are some interesting artificial intelligence tools, Meta, which is a Chan Zuckerberg project tool, and IRIS.ai, which is a small Danish firm, which a number of the large publishers use, is also AI-based product. When we look at repositories, most of the software solutions are not-for-profit. There appears to me to be a fair amount of redundancy in this arena. The sector seems to have an inability to not invent new things or add additional products, even when we have a bunch that are already pretty good. So in some cases, this makes sense where you have things like Avalon, which does media, and Omeka, which does exhibits, and the preprints of the Open Science framework. So a lot of these are not-for-profit, with bpress being the obvious example. When we look at the repositories that are collections of data, many of these are, the most powerful ones are commercial. So Figshare, SlideShare, SSRN. There are some very large non-commercial ones. Zendo is a European project. And it's interesting to speculate on whether Sci-Hub is commercial or not. When we look at publishing, this is a very large category, and in my analysis of this, it becomes even larger because I included all of the tools that were in John Maxwell study, that he and his group study called the Mind the Gap, which is another Mellon-funded project that looked at publishing specifically. There's a good mix of commercial and not-for-profit pieces in this sector. The commercial tools are large and robust, as you would anticipate. They typically support the large commercial publishers. There are some important not-for-profit open tools. OJS is a good example, and the various tools from COCO. Again, it seems to me that there's a fair amount of redundancy in the open not-for-profit arena here, especially with monographic publishing, where there are a fairly large number of early developing tools that are just starting to come online. When we look at preservation, most of the tools in this arena are not-for-profit. It does include the most notable and obvious failure of the open and not-for-profit piece of our environment with the Digital Preservation Network. My general sense of preservation is that the tools are there. It's just whether the systems to use those tools effectively is in place, I think, is an interesting question. And finally, when we look at assessment tools, again, most of the important tools in this arena are controlled by the for-profit commercial sector. Altmetrics, Plum Analytics, Dimensions, Pure, Simplistic Elements. The only real open tools in this space are Vivo and DSpace Crisp, which is primarily used in the European context. So I think when we look at this sector, we look at it across the board. We can see that the commercial firms have grabbed sort of each end of the process, both at the researcher tools and at the assessment tools. And whether or not they can bring together the whole workflow and dominate it, or whether or not the advantages of open infrastructure can make this work, I think is an interesting and open question. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
And it helps if I unmute myself. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you so much, David. And that was a great overview of the fantastic work that just got published as the bibliography that, as David just described, gives us a really deep view and a lot of jumping off points into some specific areas of interest in the scholarly communication space. So I do hope everybody will go and take a look at that new publication, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to talk about two things that we accomplished in the Mapping the Scholarly Communications Landscape project. The first of those is the Census of Infrastructure Providers, which hopefully many of you are familiar with at this point, and maybe some of you even participated with and may be more familiar with than you even want to admit. A couple of notes before I go into some of the findings that we've had with the census. The census itself was grounded in some of the work that Educopia Institute has been doing over the course of really its entire lifespan. So Educopia was founded in 2006, and for more than a dozen years, well over a dozen years at this point, we have been working with a wide variety of both communities and organizations to both understand what it is that communities and collaborative ventures undertaken by academic institutions, what those have in common, what they don't, and how they grow and change over time, and then above all else, what differentiates the ones that stick around from those that have very short lifespans. So, for example, what differentiates, something like Project Bamboo from which had a very short lifespan, from much longer-lived environments and services and other things, name it from Scalar to Hobby Trust, et cetera. And so, with that work, we have drawn on a tremendous amount of different disciplines. We're very interdisciplinary, looking at business, organizational psychology, looking at sociology of businesses, sociology of organizations and communities, also looking at things like social movement theories, et cetera, in order to understand how communities do grow and change over time and how that maps and also deviates from the way that businesses grow and change over time. So all of that is to say there's this community cultivation field guide that we published that, again, hopefully some of you have come into contact with, that is free and open. It summarizes a lot of what we had learned as of 2018 when we published it. And it provides a snapshot of the model or the framework that we use and that guides our work at Educopia. And what that field guide gives is ways to assess factors that we've found over time influence the sustainability and health of a broad range of communities in our scholarly communication space. And so the community cultivation framework became the grounding for the census and gave us a tool that we could use to help identify what kinds of technical and organizational, fiscal, administrative, governance, engagement, like community engagement, and HR and staffing questions we could reasonably pose and reliably use to assess the overall health and stability both of an individual service or tool or organization, and then also the aggregate, so our full scholarly communication system. And using the results of the census instrument that we designed and the inventory that follows from that, we created pilot visualizations of what the system of scholarly communications looks like, and we published that with a formal report in June of 2019. So these are the wonderful initial guinea pigs who were willing to be our testers of this survey instrument. And the survey instrument was dense. There are 123 questions. It is openly available. You can go either to our website to get it, or you can go to Invest in Open Infrastructure, and I'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes, where this survey instrument is still up and live and is still collecting data on scholarly communication resources. But there were 123 questions, or up to 123 questions, depending on logic, that really delved into all of the aspects of the organizational form or community form. It doesn't have to be a 501c3 or it can be a hosted program, et cetera. It can be things like Blacklight that really don't have a traditional organizational form, but do have a lot of the vestiges that we would expect of that because it's a longstanding community that continues to work together. So these 123 questions delved into the mission, the vision, the scoping, the technical development and design, the administrative and fiscal scaffolding that helps to make sure that hopefully these things do last over time, community engagement activities, the governance models, and other, other factors and details of these different communities and organizations. We conducted the census from February through March of 2019, and we did that through direct invitations. So we contacted just over 200 scholarly communication resource providers. We worked with our advisory board, and certainly the PIs worked hard to identify scholarly communication resource providers according to that definition that David presented just a few moments ago. The census also remained open, and again, I'll talk about this in a minute, through another venue after that time, and continues to remain open through Invest in Open Infrastructure, which is a new, relatively new project that is building on some of the work that we've done. So during that initial month-long period, we had more than 60 scholarly communication resources respond to us, and more than 40 ultimately chose to participate in the census. And again, the instrument took, it was 123 questions. It took between an hour and 3.5 hours for SCR or scholarly communication resource respondents to complete. And the variability in that time actually is a factor that we've continued to look at, and it's not something that we can scientifically judge, because there are lots of reasons why someone might have taken longer than another person to complete this survey, including how many people they needed to contact to find the information and those kinds of things. But variability in time was one of the factors that you can really see as a marker of how well documented an organization was and how much information it was able to give us in the end. So those that actually took less time to complete the survey, in many cases had fuller information, had better information, and had links to where you could see their production roadmap or their mission and value statements or other key components that we were asking about online. As part of this work, and as part of what fed the report that we published in June of last year, our team also researched some of the basic information, so not trying to fill in everything, but we got basic information about 96 additional communities and organizations, and created from that a composite data set that combined the researched data, which was gathered by Mike Roy and others at Middlebury, along with a few of the fields of what we had gathered in the respondents' anonymized data from the census. And that composite data set provides us with more of a system level view of the broad range of tools and services and platforms that are in use today, including their purposes, their founding dates, their locations, and other basic information that we were able to quickly compile and show. And so there are data visualizations that are built on that again, you can get to through our website, where the report is also available. And I think there are some pasting ins of URLs that are happening in the background that will give you a lot of the information in synthesis, and again, anonymized. So what are a couple of the things that the census has been able to tell us? Some of what it is telling us in this first run is information that gives us a baseline. It gives us a baseline both for the system through the representative sample that stepped forward and actually was willing to take the census, and then so for that composite, and then also for individual scholarly communication tools and services and other organizational types. So that baseline is valuable in and of itself. It can tell us a little bit about what the landscape looks like today. It can tell us a bit about how initiatives are currently supported and how stable those support apparatuses are. It can show us some of the risks, and it definitely did. It can also show us some of the ways that we can improve. So how can we build and fund tools and services in ways that are more sustainable? And then one of the questions that we asked throughout was whether we could responsibly use the types of information that we were gathering to guide investments. So really to guide how libraries, archives, museums, publishers, others who lean on different components of the scholarly communications world, how they invest their funds, and then also potentially how governments and foundations invest their funds. And again, that has started to grow in the direction of invest in open infrastructure, which did not grow out of this project, but grew adjacent to this project, and which has already embedded the census in a way that we hope will allow this not just to be a one-time snapshot, but a long-term monitoring tool that can help us not monitor individual scholarly communication resources in some heavy-handed way, but really to monitor the health of the field and to understand what it means if we invest our money differently over time. So some of the more granular things that we learned, which you can go and you can see in the report, and you can also see speculations that go a little bit beyond what the data itself showed through a blog post that I produced last year that is also linked from the website. It's the Red Queen's Race piece. And you can see a lot more there than I can summarize in just a couple of minutes here. But some of the key things that we have noticed are around funding source and what it means to be in a space like ours, and what is funding that, and how are the individual SCR, scholarly communication resources, being funded, and how stable is that funding? And of all the areas of concern that we highlighted in the report, I would say none is actually more compelling than the financial self-descriptions that were provided by respondents. So many of the respondents reported that they had low to no financial reserves. Most did not reconcile their books on a regular schedule. Many of them lacked the basic checks and balances that keep businesses safe from both accidental and purposeful financial misreporting. So there are things there that are of interest certainly to us. They're also of interest to the field at large, and are certainly among the things that we hope will continue to be chronicled in the future. Other things that we found, lots of open standards, just like lots of different types of scholarly communication resources are out there. There were lots and lots of open standards that were cited. Very few of the players cited the same open standards. So when we started looking at interoperability options and things of that nature, part of what we saw in the census was how complicated it is to start to build out of all of these one-off projects something that actually does work at the system level. And another project that Educopia is currently leading, that's the Next Generation Library Publishing Project, funded by the Arcadia Foundation, is looking at this deeply right now as well, and is finding similar things. And I'm happy to talk to people about that separately if that's of interest. Other things, and well, this highlights the interoperability piece, so I won't spend more time on that. Overall, what the census told us is that while cooperation is valorized, it's not really practiced. And I think the interoperability and the open standards and things like that, they indicate that there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of desire towards transparency and openness, but in terms of it actually being something that can lead to interoperability, we're about 10 steps away from that in most cases. There's a lot of bootstrapping and agility. There's not a lot of sustainability. There's an uneven knowledge of even basic business functions, and competition and lack of alignment are still hallmarks within the system. Now that brings us to the case studies. So in the composite, looking at the census, we can get a really good view of what's happening at the kind of basic and system level. Going into deeper case studies is providing us, and these are not yet published, but they will be shortly, is providing us the opportunity to look more deeply at what kinds of things what are the kinds of things that make it hard to have good fiscal policies in place. So we might have noticed that there weren't good fiscal policies in place in the census, but now why? Can we see that a little bit more deeply? Can we see why the types of things that we might have expected people to be able to show us were not there? And so I'm going to use Humanities Commons as a very quick example, and I will be wrapping this up in about a minute. So do know that this is going to go very quickly on the case studies, and that there will be a release forthcoming shortly that will give you the ability to look deeply into a number of case studies. But looking at something like Humanities Commons, and just looking at the organizational model piece of it, Humanities Commons is a fantastic tool. It's repository software, publishing. It's got some annotation components to it. It serves a broad user base that includes societies as well as academic institutions now and individual users. When you look at how the organization formed, it started at MLA, the Modern Language Association, and was hosted as a project first and then as a program. When it was a program, it expanded some, but all of the financial information was kind of embedded, and all the organizational information was embedded within MLA. Well, now for the last year, they've been shifting from MLA over to the Michigan State University, which is now becoming the host. They're on the verge of becoming the official host. And looking at the kinds of things that move means and what came to light about what it means to be housed within an academic institution. What does that mean for your governance? Really, you're now officially tied to the board of the university or the board of trustees. What does that mean for a community governed entity? How do these different organizational structures, a nonprofit versus an academic institution, affect what can be maintained transparently and who can make decisions? And so those are the kinds of things that we're really delving into as we move into these case studies. So I'm going to wrap there and hand it over to Mike, who I think already has the ability to drive the slides from here.
Hi, thanks everybody. I'm Mike Roy. I'm from Middlebury College, and the first three sections that you've just learned about, the bibliographic review, the census, and these case studies really look at the supply side, looking at the people who are creating and trying to sustain these technologies. In the next two sections, first the one I'm going to talk about, and then the last wrap up, which David will talk about, sort of focus on the demand side. So looking at how do libraries currently interact with this infrastructure and support that infrastructure. So the piece I'm going to talk about is the library survey, and it's really building on David's work on the 2.5% initiative, just trying to find out the current state of affairs in terms of library investment in this infrastructure. So the basic question that we've asked is, how much do libraries spend on the infrastructure that supports publication, access, and preservation of scholarship and data? And I can figure this out. I'm going the wrong direction. And we have, similar to the bibliographic scan, we create a kind of taxonomy to break down those different types of infrastructures and different types of investments into the 11 different categories you can see here. And I should say now that Kathleen Shearer and from CORE and working with Carl, a lot of work that led to these categories. So they've done a very similar survey of Canadian libraries. And so we're one of the things that we'll be able to do going forward is to kind of match those up and kind of look how this varies between these two survey instruments. So we used our network of contacts in the library world, mostly in the US, and this is who answered the survey. So we got, 91 schools answered in total. A third of them came from doctoral universities, very high research activities, what we typically might call R1s. And then another almost third came from small liberal arts colleges like Middlebury. And then you can see the rest as it's spread out. And what we, I keep going the wrong direction. I will figure this out eventually. And then in terms of who answered it, in terms of institution size, we asked how many students are enrolled in total at your institution. I should say as a side note, I showed this graph to my wife and she said it looked a bit like the coronavirus spread. That's not what this is about. But it basically, the average enrollment was around 22,000. There were a few very large institutions, and some very, very small, but it averaged out about 22,000. And before I dive deep into kind of a skim of the results, I want to just put a few caveats. So we got 91 responses, partly I think because it was a relatively rigorous instrument. I would suspect, and so I don't think it's not necessarily representative, and I fear that this may have kind of bias towards fans of open. So if you're investing a great deal in this, you may be more inclined to fill out the survey than not. We did not get everybody to complete the survey, so some of the results are not necessarily great because there's holes in the data, and so we're still working on that. We got one institution that is a kind of anomalous, and so we may end up pulling that piece out because that may skew the results a bit. One of the reports that we got from nearly everybody is that this was very hard to do, very similar to the census work that we were doing, and so just questions about how do we create this in a more streamlined manner that it's easier to collect this. And then the other was because we focused on libraries, we got a bunch of feedback from folks who said that we really should be looking at the institution level, thinking about where does IT, where does the provost, where do other research units play into all of this, and we were really focused on library investment. The kind of top level findings, what we discovered is that the 91 schools in total invested $14.1 million, which averages out to about $150,000 per library. Going back to David's idea of the 2.5%, if you look at the budgets for those libraries with salary, it represents about 1.5%. And if you look at it without salary, it's about 2.8%. Another way of looking at it is thinking about the amount of money per student enrolled, and that averaged out at about $8. I will say, and hopefully the caveats made this clear, that you're really getting a sneak peek of our preliminary pass through this data. We want to really look at it a little more carefully. So I wouldn't quote these numbers quite yet, and we will be publishing a formal report that will let you have numbers that are a little bit more reliable. But these are pretty good numbers. In terms of how this money gets spread out, we asked, are you spending it on staffing, repositories, preservation, and so forth? And you can see that 72% of it goes towards staffing, 11% goes to hosted repositories, and then the rest is all less than 10%, which was interesting. And we asked, within staff, we were able to ask, like, how is those staff dollars being spent? And over 3 million of it is going towards repositories, a great deal towards research data, infrastructure, storage, and you can see it dropping down considerably over time. And then we took out the staffing dollars and just asked for non-staffing dollars, where does the money go? Again, hosted repositories, preservation, consulting, hosted platforms are the kind of top of the line, and then you can see a lot of the falling away for these other categories. And then just to close on this kind of first glimpse at the work that we're doing in terms of what we're planning to do next, the first step will be to finish analyzing the data more carefully and then sharing the results back with respondents. And we'll then be writing this up and sharing it through the same mechanism off of our project website and then publishing it through Educopia. Then one of the questions that we asked in the grant is this an activity that needs to be sustained over time? Very similar to the questions that Catherine was asking about the census. And so the question then becomes refining the instrument, figuring out the periodicity of how often we poll the community, and then finding a home for this if we decide that this is a worthwhile activity. And then, as you might imagine, the kind of short-term step is to combine this with all of the other outputs of this project to ask, what does this say about the current state of affairs, both supply and demand, providers and users, and where to go from there. So that is my piece, and I'm going to hand it back to David for the last section.
So the last piece I'm going to talk about is a series of focus groups that we did with library leaders over the time period beginning with a couple we did at the ALA annual conference in June of 19, summit at ARL in September, summit CNI in December of 19, and then we did a series of virtual focus groups in February of this year. We had 41 total participants, 10 from liberal arts colleges, 7 from mid-sized universities, and 23 from research universities. So, and 1 from an organization that serves academic libraries. So it was a reasonably representative group. Again, we might have a sample bias that would indicate people who cared about this more were the ones who were more likely to show up. So it's a little hard, and it's not a particularly large group, but the conversations were very rich, and we had a script, but very rarely did we get past the third question before they went off on their own in different and I think very interesting ways. So not particularly structured data. I want to run through sort of a series of themes that came out of these conversations. When we started out by asking about the amount of investment, and there was as you would expect based on the size of the institutions, a wide range of expenditures, but also inside of a category of institution, there were sometimes significant differences. I think that's particularly true with smaller institutions. Some made fairly reasonable. I would expect in the smaller institutions there would be a lot more variability. But there was also variability with large universities. Interestingly, and most of the people we were talking to were library directors. Often they had a difficult time sitting at a table and being asked how much money do they actually spend. It wasn't like collections money, where I suspect all of them could have given you down to at least the rounded to the nearest 100,000 how much money they spent on collections. Many of them really didn't have a good way of thinking about this. They're clearly often expressed as, so what are the standards? How do we think about this? We're going to decide. We have to know how to what the methodology is, obviously. And staffing was also a particularly difficult thing to come to grips with, in part because at larger and many institutions, a lot of that staffing happens in the IT organization or in other organizations outside of the library, but also in some particularly smaller institutions, libraries have lines and not budgets. So it's not clear how to deal with staff all the time. And that's, as Mike showed, it's a significant piece of how much is invested. Some of the people who had done the earlier 2.5 survey that Mike and I did in the fall of 17 found that to be very difficult and time consuming. And a number of people indicated that the 2.5% number was much lower than it really needed to be to sustain the infrastructure that we have to have. So we asked about what drives decisions. Many people wanted to be part of a community. Often open and not for profit were preferred, although there were a number of people who said that open mattered more than whether or not the platform was for profit. And open meant, in many cases, that they could get out of that they could extract their data and move to a different provider using the same system. And often directors, maybe surprisingly, admitted that a lot of the reason they made the decisions on particular tools or projects that they would invest in had to do with, I've called it here, keeping up with the Joneses, but it really was a matter of what their peers did was what they were likely to do. This was a fairly clear piece that came from directors. Although there was some contrary opinion which said they didn't want to invest simply to virtue signal, that they weren't going to join something just because everybody else. So there was a split, but in the majority, I think, would have said they trusted their peers and made their investments based on what the people they knew and thought well of in their group did. Particularly smaller organizations tended to value consortiums. because the group would provide some cushion and could make a collective investment that was not possible by the individual institution. And one library director refreshingly said they just made the decisions on the seat of their pants. A level of honesty we didn't always see. And when we asked about what matters in choosing tools, typically it was the functionality rather than the particulars of the tool itself. There was a significant concern about ownership of the content and expressed interest in privacy, although other people suggested that expressed interest was not often carried through in practice. There was a specific piece about balancing doing something in-house, which costs staffing, and doing things, purchasing services, which had out-of-pocket costs. Interestingly, a number of people talked about that if you outsourced, you lost the in-house expertise, which they considered to be valuable. And importantly here, an exit strategy was very important. There was a fair amount of expressed skepticism about the library community's ability to create and maintain projects. So at the library director level, when they looked out at the whole community, particularly the open part of the community, there was a lot of concern about how poorly in many ways we're performing. The decision-making processes inside of library projects was often considered to be time-consuming, particularly in dealing with the overhead that library leadership had to involve themselves in. There was a number of people expressed concern that the governance and decision-making process there was too much emphasis on consensus and being too inclusive, which meant that the organizations weren't particularly nimble in their ability to make things happen. And there was a concern that the library community often tends to create multiple solutions to a problem, and that this spreads resources, the available resources too thin. So too many projects, which in my personal opinion grows out of the way every university thinks they do it better than every other university. It's not simply a library issue in many cases, but this was clearly being recognized as something that the community overall needed to start to figure out. And a piece of this, and Catherine touched on this when she talked about if you have a project embedded in another university or in some other structure, there was a concern about transparency. And particularly less about the technical issues, because often projects have a roadmap that does that pretty well, but about governance and finances was really a piece of this. And this may come about, as Catherine talked about with the census, is that many of the providers really don't have good, easy to access information about their finances. There was a very clear frustration that's sometimes been talked about as membership fatigue in how open projects are funded. You get a solicitation from dozens of projects a year, and they all want $5,000 to $20,000 of your money, and that this membership model, while in theory it makes some sense, the projects don't work together. And so you're hit with a lot of individual things that all seem important, but collectively it doesn't always seem like you're making that money you have available, investing it wisely. Inevitably, many of these projects start off as grants or ad hoc projects that come out of individual institutions, but inevitably they end up migrating to a membership model because no one has yet sorted out how to figure out something different, and this ends up with pleas to join from your friends and colleagues and everyone else. And again, you end up with making reasonably large investments, but that they're not necessarily coordinated. It was also noted that there are a number of really important projects in the space that are dependent on the significant support of a single institution, and that this leaves the project vulnerable either to an individual institution or to a single individual. And we can all think about projects that would fall into that category. And this is, you know, a dangerous vulnerability. So, you know, what would happen, for example, if as a result of the pandemic, Michigan decided that its investment in Mahdi Trust was no longer sustainable. And that would put a lot of things that would make life difficult for a lot of us. And importantly, there was this, as I've mentioned a couple of times, this sense that there's no way that as a community that we have the mechanism to plan a system-wide piece that would allow us to put some sort of end-to-end piece together in the way that the large commercial people are obviously trying to figure out how to do. We just haven't got the capacity at this point to make that happen. So at this point, we have about 10 minutes, so why don't we take questions?
Fantastic. So we have a number of questions stacked up for you, including some really meaty ones, and I'm going to go ahead and pitch these at you guys individually, just targeting them at people in the interest of time. So one question from Monica McCormick. And David, I'm going to give this question to you. How do you anticipate that we can use these results? So for those who've responded to the survey, is there a way to get some guidance on what we can do better, or what the organizations can do better? And for those of us in libraries who want to invest time, membership money, expertise, what can we use to determine criteria for selecting among these many tools and partners?
So when we started this, we hoped that we would have some really good answers to that. Mike has sometimes talked about what we're trying to accomplish is creating an Angie's list for this arena. We're not going to get to that in this iteration of the project, but I think we will be able to see at the end of this quite clearly is something that we probably all know. And that is that collectively, we haven't been able to create the solutions and make a series of wise investments to get us everywhere we need to go. Now, I think from my perspective, understanding that this is the case drives us to the next step, which is how do we collectively, as the academic library community in the United States or North America or more broadly in the world, how do we think about creating the systems that we need to do this? And the data that we have is not going to be sufficient to say, what's the system of investments? Catherine has mentioned Invest in Open, an organization that has that ambition. And I think that would be something to watch and to think about how we might invest in that group as a way to move it forward.
Okay, fabulous. I'm going to skip over a question here and go to Emily Gore's question, which got a couple of +1s, and just ask Catherine to expand on what she's been saying in the chat. Do you feel like there's going to be a process of natural selection here? Comment that there are too many players for survival, too many people starting new projects and organizations. So how can we leverage this research to build sustainability and fewer organizations?
So yeah, what I'll say is I think that the pandemic is going to throw all of this in even sharper relief, or all the economic repercussions of the pandemic is going to throw this in even sharper relief. And it was already coming to a kind of impasse, if you will. My very quick version of this is that it has to happen at this point. So either we are going to see libraries not band together, in which case we're going to see a few service providers emerge with for-profit mentalities that may or may not be aligned closely with academic mission, who really dominate the field as we move forward, or we're going to have to make hard choices about which of the many, many players that are out there we continue to invest in. And a lot of the investment is going to have to shift towards interoperability and towards patching together the things that we have into better, not quite end-to-end solutions, but something that is closer to it. And I really, the Invest in Open, we've brought it up several times, Invest in Open Infrastructure. Caitlin Saney is the director of that nascent organization. It is not the end-all be-all. It is not the absolute answer to this, but it is a way of trying to figure out, can we channel energy around this space of making those hard decisions as a community with community governance, but making the decisions so that you do say, okay, we're going to invest in Islandora to this degree, and we may not be investing in this brand new repository infrastructure that is not yet, ready for prime time, because right now we need to meet the established needs of established players. And simultaneously, there may be some newcomers that have great ideas that can emerge, but we've got to have some sort of peer review panel that can take and digest the kind of information that I think we were gathering with the census, really look at values alignment, and really think about what is going to serve not one institution well, but it's going to serve the system well. And I'm eager to see whether we can make that shift as a field.
Thank you for that. And Mike's put in the URL for Invest in Open. And I should mention that we will make all of these links available to you in an email that we'll send to you, along with a link to the recording on the slide. So you'll have all of that goodness available for you. One last question about the survey. Catherine has responded to some degree about this in the Q&A, but I'm going to direct this question to Mike. Biggest barriers for folks to complete the survey, and if you were going to do it again, what reflections do you have on to help increase the response rate or completion rate?
Great. Is my audio working?
Yes.
Okay, super. Yeah, so there's an old saw that, if you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think part of the challenge here is that as a community, we haven't really been thinking about our investments in this sort of infrastructure. And so some of the challenge really on the library survey side is that it's a completely different way of thinking about where the money goes. And so until this becomes something that is important to the community, and they start, and we start keeping records and tracking these kinds of investments systematically, it's always going to be a big lift, I think, to collect it. I know some of the respondents that found it easy to fill out the survey have actually started using their ERM to mark open investments, and so it's just the click of a button, you get a report in order to gather that information. So I think that the challenge is really a cultural challenge, is getting folks to think about this as something that matters, and then thinking about how do you actually keep track of this and help shape your portfolio of how you spend your money to prioritize creating this new way of working. So I'd say and then I also suspect that, as with many of these year-over-year surveys, that the first time is the hardest, and once you have those records, it's much easier to maintain it when you go back to fill it in again.
Well, believe it or not, we are at the end of our time together, and this has been just such a rich conversation. I feel like it's a rich introduction. I feel like it's the beginning of a conversation. So I hope we can find ways to sustain that together, and looking at my colleagues in the OCLC RLP and thinking about how we can do that with each other. But I want to thank the presenters so much, and thank you guys for being a great and engaged audience. As I mentioned, this presentation has been recorded. We will be sending out a link to the recording, the slides, other links that were shared, and of course, contact information for our panelists today. So thank you so much, and this concludes today's webinar.